Hi, I'm Michael, and welcome to Beyond the Screenplay. Today we are talking about 2015's Inside Out, one of my favorite movies, and I'm joined by the Lessons from the Screenplay team, writer Trisha Arand.
Hello, everybody.
Writer Brian Bittner.
Hello, hello.
And editor Alex Calleros.
Hello.
So Inside Out is amazing, and it is one of the videos I did what feels early on now. But it was kind of a departure in terms of like the format of the videos for the channel, because this was kind of the first one where I tried to talk about process. And in the Inside Out Blu-ray, there's a lot of really good making of material that sort of goes into Pete Docter, who directed it and co-wrote it, his process of finding what the story is and the questions he wanted to answer and all these things. So the video talks a lot about his process of trying to understand why his little girl wasn't happy anymore when she became a teenager, and just kind of the evolution that happens as we all grow up and lose the innocence of childhood, and etc. But yeah, so what I also love about the movie that I want to talk about today is just how it's like the perfect example of story structure. Like it's the one I always go to in my head, because everything is just right there on the surface. And I didn't pick that up the first time I saw it, because the first time I saw it, I was just trying not to cry the whole
the entire time.
So I think this podcast for me is just going to be trying not to cry while talking about.
Make no guarantees we won't be crying. No, I mean, I just, one of those things that we do where we talk about our just impressions of this movie. It is so beautiful. It's really, we don't get original content like this very often anymore.
Right.
Feels like it was, I think I read it was one of the highest, or is the highest grossing like original story opening of definitely any animated movie, I think, in the last however many years. And it is such an original and truly inventive approach to a story. And it works so well for the reasons that you're talking about, but also because it so completely encapsulates this world, and it's really fully realized and really intricate. And it's excellent, executed just at the highest possible level. It's really great. And it doesn't depend on any existing source material or any like prior knowledge of the character or franchise or anything like that. I love Pixar's franchises. I'm pretty excited for Toy Story 4.
I mean, I love Toy Story 3. Talking about crying.
Oh, I mean, yeah, exactly. But I'm kind of glad that Pete Docter has said that Inside Out, he is going to be a standalone movie pretty much.
Like, it's okay to have those.
Yeah.
Can we have those?
I mean, seriously.
Well, it's unfortunate. Like The Incredibles, I love that movie so much. And when they finally announced they were doing a second one, I said, great, I'm on board. And then it came out and the reviews weren't good, and I still haven't seen it. And I'm like, don't sour your thing. When you have something that's like beautiful on its own, sometimes it maybe, and Toy Story is a great example of sometimes you can make a trilogy that people love, and who knows how the fourth one will be.
Yeah.
But Inside Out's not a movie I want to see more of. I'm just like,
The Incredibles
I love
2 was okay.
Sure,
Yeah.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's bad, but like, but Inside Out's one of those movies where I don't like. I love those characters and stuff, and I'd love to see more of them. But also, I kind of want it to just exist in its own own thing.
It's such
totally.
a perfect package, and the arc that it traces from leaving the innocence of childhood, and I mean, there's so much to talk about with this movie, but the brilliance of it just explores every possible thing about the brain and emotion and the subconscious. Like it's like everything you ever wanted to explore about human psychology in the most amazing like storytelling package. And I when I watched it again, I'm like, they do everything. They cover everything. They go into dreams. They go into like
Deja vu and abstract thinking.
Core memories,
Yeah.
how like these define you and how they're more complicated at the end. They have multiple colors on them. Like I can't imagine how much work went into like basically doing everything you possibly could with like the human brain
and pulling it off in a way that feels effortless too.
Yes.
Like,
It's
it's
not
entertaining and fun, but it's also doing all these things.
It's all necessary for the story. Like it's
Right.
not happening. It's not like kind of just being piled on as like extra stuff just to like stuff it in there. It all naturally comes out of the story, which is so mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it's so accessible. I remember reading that critics at the time, loved it instantly. And it has one of the highest ratings on Rotten Tomatoes ever. It's still like at a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes.
I feel like it's like the best movie ever. Like Citizen Kane, like maybe is ahead of it. Is like how I would rank them.
Critics at the time were worried that they loved it, and they were worried that kids wouldn't like it though, because it was so complex and that kids wouldn't really respond to it. It's not really truly a family movie. And then kids loved it. And child psychologists were saying, like, thank goodness we have this movie now that we can give this language to children so they can understand and process how they're feeling. And like, what a gift as a filmmaker to be able to further people's knowledge of themselves, which I guess all movies are really capable of, but in this very specific way. It's so good.
Few movies like give children like new tools
Yes.
to understand themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And so literally and directly as this one does.
Exactly.
But once again, you're entertained the whole time. It's not a preachy feeling movie. It does it all through really amazing entertainment, really emotional storytelling.
Well, and I think what makes it so powerful is that it isn't just kids that are getting that lesson too.
Yeah.
Like I think in general, our society
Definitely.
is not one where we talk about emotions and know how to express complex feelings.
Of course.
And so, yeah, having this framework both for kids and as adults to like talk about what's going on and kind of, even if you're not using the language of like anger is driving right now, or like grossness. Wait, what is it?
Disgust.
Right.
Yeah. Grossness.
That's what mine is called.
Grossness.
But just the idea that like as we get older, like memories, like you were saying, Alex, can be complex. They're not just happy or sad. They can be both. They can be a lot of things. And just like having that kind of acknowledged and said out loud, I think is a very useful thing.
I had an interesting experience just this morning. My mom is visiting, and I showed her the trailer to Inside Out. I said, let me show you the trailer to this movie that we're doing, and I'll tell you about it. And as soon as it started, she said, it's animated. And then she sort of, after the trailer, said, so it's a kid's movie? And I sort of said, well, and I explained the plot to her, and she said, that sounds complicated. And I said, well, yeah, and she doesn't really know. She doesn't know what a Pixar is, you know.
Yeah.
And
what is a Pixar?
Yeah. And so then I told her about it. I said, well, yeah, what's great about these movies is they sort of appeal to different audiences and stuff. And then I showed her the opening scene of Up.
Oh, you did not.
And very quickly she was so engaged and like started almost like crying and everything. And I was like, yeah, that's what Pixar is.
Well, that's Pete Docter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Pete Docter.
But even like look
man.
at like Finding Nemo, like the similar thing where Andrew Stanton talks about his own experience with his, fatherhood and that kind of thing, and how sometimes these movies are so powerful because they come from such a real intimate place, not just let's make a kids movie about some silly things,
Well, Pixar's never been afraid of just going there. You know, that's what is so special about Pixar. You see other kind of some DreamWorks movies, and they have that kind of irony and kind of safe distance,
right?
And any emotional moments are kind of just, I don't know, they're
contrived,
those shallow. It's time for the emotional moment now. Whereas, Pixar movies at their best, I think, come from these really deep places, and they're not afraid to touch, dark material. Yeah.
Very heavy material.
Yeah.
Well, and so one of the things that Meg LaFave, who co-wrote it, and she has this amazing interview on the podcast, the Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith, that I think if you want to be a screenwriter, you must go listen to that right now. It's so good. But one of the things she talked about, one of the big challenges is the number of rules that have to be established for this movie. And rewatching it, I was thinking about that and kept that in my mind. And I feel like you don't realize everything has to be explained. And it's a very complicated mechanic where there's memories, but there's core memories, and some are certain colors which attach themselves to emotions. But like if all of a sudden, if sadness touches one, it'll become permanent, and like and just how the mind works.
Long-term storage, they're vacuuming out old
islands
memories.
of personality.
That are powered by the. So when this one goes down, those like it's a lot of things to juggle. And she said that was one of the biggest hurdles: is how do you get all of that exposition done in a way that's entertaining and moving the story forward. And it's really impressive.
Well, that's why it's so remarkable, because you never feel like it's too much, but it's a lot. Like when I was watching it again, wow, they really do. They do so many different metaphors for different parts of human psychology, and they're like really clever, really unique metaphors. And there's like 100 of them in the movie.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, well, this is a lot.
Yeah, well, it works really well because they're also visual. So like when you think about the islands of personality and you think about like, first of all, their distance from sort of the central headquarters makes a lot of sense, where it's like there's this vast sort of unknowable, unconscious like pit in the middle. And then you have this, structured world around it with these islands of personality that are connected, but are not driving Riley in the same way that her emotions moment to moment are. It's very visual how that's conveyed, and it works really well. We sort of intuitively grasp like, okay, they're distant from our moment to moment life. They're permanent. And then also the way that they like start up and move when that part of her personality is being engaged. It's like, oh, good, Family Island is running, you know?
Right.
Again, all of that's visually conveyed and visually buried in there. So it really helps with all of that expository stuff.
And they're also such primal ideas,
Yes.
It's not like, oh, in her head is Larry, Barry, and Harry, and one controls the arms and one controls the legs. It's like, no, there's joy, there's disgust, there's anger. Like, it takes you 5 seconds to go, oh, okay, I get it. I know what this thing is,
Mm-hmm. It's actually, I just have to say this really quick. It's actually very similar to a short play that I wrote when I was 14, something like that. I wrote a skit for my school something, and it was taking place inside of somebody's head, and it was basically like a Star Trek
bridge
area where there were two people driving, and one was like mind and one was heart, and they were arguing with each other, and they were driving, and then all of the other different, they were the 5 senses basically. So then like eyes was doing something, and then like, but this sort of, we do understand those relationships because we all feel pulled in these different directions like all the time. So it's what you were saying, simple and clean and easy to understand.
Well, there's also the early 90s sitcom Herman's Head.
Oh
yeah, which was literally this. You guys are a little bit younger than me. Herman's Head was just a sort of kind of corny sitcom about a guy who works in an office and has friends and relationships and whatever, but inside his head are intelligence, anxiety, sensitivity, and lust.
Wow.
And lust is like just like a gross sports loving dude. Sensitivity is just like a sweet woman. Anxiety is like a guy with the bow tie who's always freaking out, and intelligence is Niles Crane, basically, And so then every time they're, so it's the complete opposite tonally from Inside Out, but it's the exact same premise, basically, is that they are fighting over, they're in their head arguing about what should we do in the situation? This girl is here and she's vulnerable, but she is married to my friend. And so lust is like, who cares? And sensitivity is like, let's listen to her. And, all that kind of stuff. For me, it was like when I saw the trailer to Inside Out, I thought, oh, I've seen this before. But also, it's like we talked in the adaptation thing. You can do something that's kind of been done before, or like that almost seems gimmicky or almost seems too easy. But if you do it well and you do it with this much sort of professionalism and it absolutely works.
Well, so my question is then, is Herman in that show, is Herman a different character than the ones that are living inside his head? Or are they him essentially?
I would say he's just a normal person. He's like a vanilla dude, basically. But then the different, like literally when they have to tie up lust at one point. So the other 3 are tying up lust so that he can let this girl walk out of his apartment without,
wow.
Yeah. It hasn't aged well in terms
problems.
of yeah.
Well, because I think one of the smartest things about Inside Out is that Riley is sort of a separate character from the other 5. It works really well because it almost allows them to, and I think you were talking about this in your original video, Michael, but the approach of the writers was essentially like these 5 emotions are sort of parenting her, where she exists outside of them. And they say like, we're doing this or we're doing that, but they aren't Riley. Riley sort of exists outside of them, and their relationship to her is one of love. Like they're just they love her so much. They're just trying to help her through all of this. And so it uncomplicates that in a pretty necessary way, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think it could also be taken as a really interesting statement about who are we? What is consciousness?
Right.
Who are we? Like, we are not our emotions. Our emotions are this separate thing kind of happening to us.
Yeah.
And it's almost allowing people, if you take this metaphor literally from Inside Out, you're not necessarily responsible for all your emotions. You're responsible for maybe what to do once they hit, but you are not your emotions. They are hitting you, and you then choose what to do with that. But I kind of like separating out emotions from one's actual identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's cool that the story is also talking about like what happens if you try to push out some emotions and try to only feel the ones that you're comfortable feeling.
Right.
And I think that's also why this just works so well as an example of like archetypal story structure.
By the way,
yeah,
every time, I just want to bring a note of this, like every time Michael and I are working on a writing project, at some point he'll be like, Inside Out, we got to pull up the scene from Inside Out. This is the perfect midpoint. Inside Out's got the perfect thing.
Well, if they've been listening to the podcast, they've heard him also talk about
also on the podcast,
all the time.
Yeah,
like literally we're working on like some a script recently, and he like pulled up multiple scenes from Inside Out. Like, but how does Inside Out do it? Anyway, it's a good example. It's a good example.
Yeah, it's the perfect example of like when they're writing, what they're writing in these screenwriting books, and if you're trying to visualize it and have an example of like, what does this look like in practice? Inside Out is that, and it's so accessible because, as I've said before, the characters are their journeys, right? Like, so Joy is Joy, and Joy needs to learn to embrace sadness. Like, literally, it's all there on the surface.
That is the theme.
Right. Yeah. And like, there's the inciting incident where they get taken to a whole other world is very clear. Like, she and Sadness are sent off into the world of the mind. The midpoint where the protagonist learns part of the message, but like doesn't fully get it, is literally Joy is trying to cheer up Bing Bong because they're trying to go somewhere and it's not working. And then Sadness comes in and just like listens and lets him be sad, and it works. Yeah. And so Joy, you see her kind of like put the dots together, but she doesn't get to finish it. And then I feel like it's the best example of that crisis point, right? Where like at the end of Act 2, there's the moment where the protagonist has kind of learned, like she and Sadness are getting along, but she hasn't quite learned it. And so at that last moment, she decides to leave Sadness behind because she thinks that's the only way to do it. And it ends up backfiring. And she's down there with Bing Bong and all hope is lost. And it's only at that moment that she has to learn to embrace sadness. And then there's the whole part where like she can escape, but not without sacrificing something. And that's where Bing Bong comes in and everybody cries. It's just
Thanos snaps and
and Bing Bong disappears. Anyway, yeah, it's if you want to see structure laid out in an enjoyable movie, Inside Out is such a good example of that, and I'm obsessed with it for that reason.
I also like that there are these sort of, Trish, as you were talking about, Riley is a different character, so it's like you have these dual protagonists. Joy is sort of unquestionably the protagonist of Inside Out, but you're also following the real life, on the outside of the body. You're following Riley and her, and they have sort of the same goal. They need to get to the same place, but they're very different characters, and they have different ways of going about it. So it's kind of neat to follow those two stories where you're like, even though I'm not even like as invested in Riley's story, but I still just love this character and this family and like watching them interact. And that's also the animation. I just love how
I love the way they look.
Yeah, the humanity of it. It's just like I would find myself tearing up just when they were like having fun together, and I'm like, this is such a nice
especially
moment.
like the dad's eyes.
Yeah,
the eyes they really nail in this one.
Yeah. I saw Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky a couple weeks ago, and there's a moment where one of the main characters is a little boy. He takes out a trumpet to blow it for like the morning like reveille kind of thing, and he blows it. And it goes like, and he kind of like wets his lips and then blows it again. And I just thought, it's animation, and like they didn't have to do that moment. That moment cost them time and money, but that moment just made me go, I'm watching a human being right now.
Right.
I love those, and Pixar is full of those moments.
And Doctor is a huge Miyazaki fan. Like,
oh, really?
He is like one of his major influences. He's talked about it multiple times, and he worked on
House Moving Castle.
Yeah, House Moving Castle.
Oh, really?
Like American. Yeah, he did. So it totally makes sense. But I think what you're talking about Riley and like why we are invested in her, I think we get so invested in her because of what I was saying earlier about how much the emotions love her and how much Joy loves her. Like they really do have to spend that amount of time in the first act establishing that deep connection. Joy is the first emotion that is there, and she is so connected and engaged. That beautiful scene where they're skating, like, Riley is skating on the pond and Joy pulls it up, even though she's supposed to be like showing a dream or whatever. She's like, I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to pull up this beautiful memory. And then when they're skating, unless you have that moment, we become so much less invested in Riley and Riley's story. And so that is what really sells us on Joy's journey, because it's everything to her. Riley is everything to Joy. And so, yeah, very effective. So moving. Beautiful.
Yeah. And I think it's also why it's a good example of having a protagonist that is flawed, that is still like likable, and that you're on the side of. Because I think that's something I think about when writing a lot as a challenge, is like, how do you make sure your protagonist has a flaw that needs to be changed, and it's like a deeply rooted flaw that's causing problems, but you also need to be on their team and like them and be kind of with them on that journey. And I think Joy is such a great example how they designed her to have that thing where you're rooting for Joy. It's like on the surface it makes sense, like Joy, like let's have everything be happy. And I think having her be connected to Riley in that way helps you connect also.
Well, and it's fascinating, in your video you were talking about their process and that point in their process, because they worked on this movie for years and years and years, which just sounds exhausting to me when I read about it. But that point in their process where Joy was mean.
I feel like Pixar has had this problem with a few movies. I think the original Toy Story, Woody was like super mean. Like I remember seeing them behind the scenes and they had the same kind of like storyboards up, and Woody was just like yelling at everybody and like almost like a dictator of the toys. And it's like, it's interesting. That's like the first instinct is like, they're a flawed character, make them super flawed. But then you realize, oh, they're flawed in like this deeper way that's not on the surface. Yeah.
Well, especially with Joy, like it doesn't make sense to make Joy be an angry character.
Right. Of course not.
What makes sense, as you point out in the video, Michael, is to make Joy be her facade almost,
right?
Because already you have emotions who are three-dimensional characters, which kind of doesn't make sense, but it makes for a much more interesting movie. That like, oh, sadness can be happy about something and anger can be worried about something. But especially Joy, you have to go really three-dimensional with her. But there's always this facade of, hey guys, it's fine. I have an idea. Like, I'm really worried about this thing, but I'm just going to pretend everything's fine and hopefully everything will be fine. And that's the root of all drama, basically, is to have that facade. But to have her facade sort of be who she's supposed to be, but also deeply, underneath the surface, there's more to it. And then that's also what the meta story is about having Riley go through the same thing. Like, it's just, yeah.
And at her darkest moment, she cries and Joy lets herself be sad.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Perfect structure.
Yeah, well, it's that idea that we've all heard before, which is that your weaknesses are your strengths just pushed too far, right? So that idea that Joy is incredible, and what she gives to Riley is beautiful and incredible. And like Riley is overall a very joyful kid and a happy character and all this stuff. And that's because of Joy. And so we see all the merit of what Joy is doing. And in that moment where Riley's so disappointed that she's moved into this new house and she's sad the moving van's not there, and everyone else, all the other emotions are freaking out. And Joy's like, no, I have an idea. We're going to play hockey with her parents. And you see how beautiful and valuable that is. And it gets you again right onto Joy's side, where you're there with her and you're like, she is helping Riley. She's saving Riley from some of the difficulty that she's in. But then pushed to an extreme is what causes all of her problems, where she can't let Riley feel sadness. And that is what Riley needs to feel. So it's a really smart approach to a character flaw. And I guess it did take them a while to get there, but it works so well. I
think it's a great example of what, it shows what can happen when you take your time with story development, because there's so many different versions of this movie that would not have been as good. And this is like such an amazing, perfect version of itself. I can't imagine how long this took to think of all of these different aspects of this movie and make it work together so holistically.
I think the number's 4 years.
4 years.
Yeah. And they were pretty much pitching as they were developing, because they developed it in a writer's room, essentially. Half women, by the way, very important. They were basically developing it in a writer's room, and then they were constantly having to report on it and like pitch it and keep pitching it and keep pitching it over and over to all the like grand high muckety mucks at Pixar. And they knew there were like, even as they were developing it, each version, it's getting closer, but it's not there. They knew there were problems with it. I'm sure Michael knows a lot more about the development.
Well, because one of the things we talk about in the video is, and that I think was really cool for them to put on the Blu-ray extra features, is Pete Docter went into it, knowing that he wanted to look at something that was real and from his life, and the thing he always struggled with as a child was fear. And so originally joy was paired with fear because he thought that was, what he needed to learn. And it seems like it was basically only when they were kind of getting down to it and it still wasn't working, and he was trying to make fear be the right component, but it wasn't happening, that he went on this walk through the woods and videotaped himself, realizing
as we all do,
right, that sadness is the answer. And I think that's I like that idea. And another thing that Meg Lefebvre says in that interview in the Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith is that if you're writing a story in which a character has a catharsis, odds are you probably need to have a catharsis too. And I think it's a cool way to look at it. I think that if you're trying to make something that's honest and emotional, you have to allow yourself to be honest and emotional. And that's also what this movie is about in a lot of ways. But I think it's a really important lesson for any kind of storyteller.
It's also a good lesson in don't be attached to your first kind of direction.
Yeah.
Because it's, I have that problem sometimes where it's like, oh, my brilliant idea is going to have this twist at the end and it's going to all lead up to this thing. But maybe that's not actually what this thing is. That's how you kind of got started on this journey, but where it actually wants to go somewhere totally different. And it's important to be open to that and not be forcing something into your predetermined idea. Because if they had stuck with fear, I wouldn't like this movie as much. The whole, deep emotional catharsis is the fact that sadness
the opposite of joy.
And it's this thing that we all push away in our lives, especially here in America. We have this, very optimistic, well, maybe not so much anymore, but we used to have this very optimistic progress, mentality, and it doesn't leave much room for just like feeling bad sometimes.
Pete Docter, I was reading in that like sort of dark moment that he was having where he realized the story wasn't working and he ended up going on that walk. He was imagining, he kind of thought he was going to get fired. And he was imagining how sad he would be to say goodbye to everybody at Pixar and to have to leave that place where he felt he was known and cared for. And that kind of like that catharsis that kind of gave him the key of like, the people that know me the most are the ones that I cry with and for, and really honest and raw realization, and one that I think is the only thing that makes this movie have the just emotional impact that it does. This movie's devastating.
Well, it gets pretty really dark when she's running away and like her like emotions are like shutting down. Like, it's like this is like a metaphor like for depression now. This is like getting really serious. It's like she's not going to feel anything anymore.
Well, part of that, I'm going to get real here for a minute because this is an Inside Out podcast. We might as well. Part of that, I think, is because the external crisis that they introduce is this moving to a new place. I think it's so relatable how isolated you feel, how lonely you feel, how out of place, out of touch. So I grew up in a military family. So I moved every 3 years that I was growing up. And I moved when I was 10, very close to Riley's age. And then I moved again when I was 15. And that was sort of like my last big move. And first of all, no one told me this movie was about moving. And so I went into it and I was like, oh my God, the crisis is that they're moving. And I just regressed immediately to being 9 years old, 10 years old, lying face down on the floor in my new empty house, crying my eyes out because that's how it feels. And reading about the development of this movie, they tried a couple of different kinds of things. Like the original thing was a Thanksgiving Day pageant and Riley wanted to be the star.
Oh, right, yeah.
It doesn't have the same impact as being pulled away from all of this stuff. And it works. It's just tapping into something that is so fundamental of an experience, because whether or not we did it as a kid, we have all moved to a new place at some point. Maybe not thousands of miles away, maybe just a new house or a new school or whatever, or a friend moved away. Any one of those things, we know how that feels and how, just sad and isolating it can be. And
it can be the most exciting moments, but also the most scary.
Exactly. It's really, really smart writing. I'm glad that they didn't settle on their first idea, like you were saying, Alex. Yeah.
Well, because I feel like it works obviously like for you, Trisha, someone that has experienced that, but as someone who didn't move at all as a child until I went away to college, I feel like it's still that idea is an experience that's really relatable.
Any massive change in your life.
Right.
Sure.
And even just like starting like middle school for the first time. Like I've never been in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Like who are these people? Like how are you supposed to operate when you're not in
first day of
elementary?
school is something
Right.
we all have had.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it's a really good dramatization that is specific, but then also has ripples that are accessible in all the other ways.
Yeah, you don't have to have moved to understand what she's going through. Yeah.
Although if you have moved,
Sure.
God bless. God bless you, Pete Docter. And he did move when he was young. He moved, his folks moved them to Europe for a while when he was really young. And it was pretty devastating for him. So also from Minnesota, currently lives in San Francisco area. That's all I'm saying. But
Right.
yeah.
Mentioning earlier just needing to have that kind of true catharsis in your own life experience to really be able to transmit it through art. And I think that's something that I've learned in my kind of recent life, because I think I lived a lot like Joy for a lot of my 20s. I think I was like, you know what, I'm going to be, just really even keeled, like keep my life real simple, like, everything's going to be just easy going. And it doesn't actually provide a whole lot of writing material. I've got a lot more writing material in the last few years of my life when I've kind of more just opened up to all different kinds of emotions and not protecting myself so much and just being more just open to whatever is going to happen and feeling it. And it's really kind of, if you want to be a writer, it's kind of necessary. You can't have that armor up. You really have to feel things and take risks and be vulnerable.
Yeah.
I would say, don't go out and try to feel terrible.
No,
but like you're saying, being open.
It's more, it's instead of being like Joy in this movie where you're kind of like papering over everything with like this facade. It's just, if you actually, if life's happening, feel it as it's happening, not running away from all the feelings. Yeah.
Because I think the opposite can be true too. Because I think one of the reasons
No, this is like our yin and yang.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like I was very much a sadness person, and I liked that's one of the reasons I like this movie, is that its ultimate message is that it's like it's okay to be sad and like not.
Oh my God,
be
were we
happy
like
all the
Joy
time.
and Sadness when we were like we're making movies back in our early 20s?
Probably.
I think we were kind of Joy and Sadness. Yeah, okay.
But I feel like it's not necessily about only joy is bad. It's too much of anything is bad.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think there's, especially I think as a college student, you can be really into like, I just feel terrible and dark and like everything's like
Right.
emotional, and like that's not helpful either. Like that's still one note, and like just calm down, everything's fine.
I literally remember like one of the first times we hung out, you were like being super emo about like a girlfriend you broke up with recently or something. And I was just like, but like now like life's pretty good, right? Like, you can be free to do more stuff. And you were just like not having it. You're like, no.
Sadness is a more real emotion.
Yeah.
Happiness.
It was like everything you're feeling, Alex, is fake. And what I'm feeling is real.
Dude.
I think
That was emo.
I think my transition was from like 90% Bing Bong when I was a kid. Just
It
like
makes so much sense.
right,
Oh
just
my
like
God, you're Bing Bong.
just whatever
Bing Bong.
silliness, part cat, part elephant, part dolphin. Just whatever like silliness, whatever weird thing I personally like. I don't care what anyone else does. And then in my 20s, I became more like fear and anger based almost. Just like, well, I guess I need to be like a regular person, and when things don't work out, then I just get frustrated and whatever. And then my sort of full circle was embracing like, oh yeah, didn't I used to like just silliness and like, and this sort of, now I feel like I've sort of come around to a point where I'm just like comfortable with who I am and with whatever dumb idea comes into my brain and like able to embrace it and stuff,
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that they have, we see the insides of other people's heads, which I think is really good.
That's like one of my favorite parts of the movie.
But I'm glad it's only like one-off jokes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So well done though.
But it is interesting when we see the insides of other people's heads, different emotions seem to be the leader, seem to be driving.
Yeah.
So in Riley's head, obviously Joy is the leader. There's no question that she's the boss, right? Everyone else treats her like she's in charge, and she is directing sort of the whole thing.
They don't know what to do without her. When she's missing, it's like, what would Joy do? What do we do?
Exactly. But then in other people's heads, other emotions are driving. So like in her mom's head, sadness is the one that's in charge in the middle of the console.
It's so brilliant.
Ooh, which is chilling. And she's not even acting like Riley's sadness necessarily. She's very matter of fact. She's very in control. She's in charge.
It's mature. It's like a
But
mature
she's
sadness.
Right.
It just makes you wonder about that character.
Yeah.
And then in the dad's head,
More anger.
It's anger driving. I don't remember.
Well,
who's
I think anger is
driving.
driving.
Anger's driving.
In his
He's
head,
a
it's like
center
there's
console.
5 angers almost.
Almost. Yeah. Seriously, it's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, to talk about story structure, I think that another reason I like this is it's an example of what I think like the hero's journey, archetypal, all that stuff is supposed to be doing, is kind of pitting, opposing ideas together, and then at the end providing a synthesis of those things, where it's like, it's
Literally, joy and sadness have to hold the sphere together.
Yes.
Yeah.
and I feel like it just reflects like our experiences where like, like Brian, you're saying you started on one side and I feel like that was how I was, where I was sadness. And then I was like, okay, it's time to get over that. And then kind of only as you get older, you kind of allow yourself to have those, know how to navigate emotions and be like, it's okay to have conflicting it's
Multicolor spherical memory balls.
Yeah.
right, exactly. So I also I appreciate that about this story, is that it's an example of how to tell a story about these kind of abstract ideas, but make it really concrete. And, there are balls that are different colors and that represents this thing, but it works and affects you emotionally in all these ways.
I mean, we've already said this, but just once again, what a gift to provide literally a visual vocabulary to humans to talk about things that are difficult to talk about.
One really well observed few moments throughout here are the relationship between Riley and her parents, and how the pressures of the parents affect Riley's emotionality. And because when you're really young, like a really young child is not really capable of considering the needs of their parents. That's kind of what thinking outside of your own immediate needs is sort of like what maturity is. The bigger picture we're able to create for ourselves, the bigger imagination of what is everyone around me feeling. That's empathy, and then trying to meet others' needs.
Yeah, I'm not there yet.
No shock, Brian. But that scene where her mom, they're all ready. Everyone is ready to be mad about the move. They're ready to scowl at the mom. And she comes in and she says, "Thank you. You've been such a big help to us. Your happiness is a gift to us in this difficult time." And immediately everyone in the console area is like, "Oh, we're team happy now. That's right, because that's what mom needs from us." It's really well observed, especially that age, that on that brink of adolescence, where you start to look at your parents and go, "What's going on in there? What do they need from me? How am I affecting them?" Rather than just being, in the childhood position, which is developmentally normal, in the childhood position of thinking only about what your own emotions are passing moment to moment.
Right. And I feel like that's another cry moment for me is at the end where she tells her parents, I know you guys want me to be happy and I tried, but I can't sometimes. I'm sad. And that they kind of have to allow her to not be happy too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Heavy stuff.
Can we talk about the voice acting?
Can we please?
Oh my God.
Because everybody in this movie is
so
perfect.
amazing.
They are perfect.
Perfectly
Absolutely.
cast across the board.
Amy Poehler, so good. All of these little moments. I was rewatching part of it this morning, I think as you were also, Brian. And when she realizes there's this moment where sadness is lying on the ground and they're in long-term memory. And she realizes that sadness has read the manuals and she goes, "You've read the manuals." Woo! Like this sort of laugh, or yeah! She makes this sound that's just like, "I've solved it." This sound is like, "You will be my map." That moment is pure Amy Poehler. Just this moment of glee where you've realized you fixed something.
Right.
She's the only reason that character works so well.
Right.
I would also say that's kind of Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec.
Oh, of course
also.
it
It's
is,
just sort of
Right.
always optimistic, even when she's maybe not actually feeling quite that way.
And in my rewatch of The Office, it was fun seeing Phyllis again.
Oh,
and
yeah.
just being reminded of
Yes.
sadness.
She's amazing.
It's how no one else could possibly.
Right. It's amazing casting.
I feel like casting Louis Black is cheating.
I mean,
It's true.
seriously.
It's just like, who should we get to play Anger? Lewis Black? Okay.
Perfect.
Right.
Done.
I mean, his performance is awesome.
Oh, of course
though.
it is. Yeah.
Because as what you were saying, the trick is to make essentially one emotion characters multi-dimensional, fully realized characters.
Which is also a job for the actors themselves.
Exactly. And his performance as Anger, but really everybody really embodies that, where they skew one direction. And of course, the writing's so good as well, but they skew one direction towards one emotion. Mindy Kaling, every word of her delivery is just dripping in sarcasm. It's amazing. But yeah, they skew one direction, but they still go through all this stuff. So, you know, when Joy isn't there and they're worried about driving, like how could we possibly be Joy? They're all tackling a problem in their own way, going through the whole like crisis of like, I can't be Joy, I'm Anger. It gives them that three-dimensional quality.
Right.
And they're fun and like funny about it too. Yes. Like it's fun to spend time with them. Right. So it's not like we're annoyed that we're spending time with these other characters.
That we have to cut away from Joy or whatever. Right. Yeah.
Also, Bill Hader is...
Yeah, I was going to say, Bill Hader, if you're listening, nothing wrong with your performance, just your character doesn't do much in the movie. He's just kind of there too, which is weird considering he's supposed to be like a main character.
Yeah. I feel like he's the most like comic reliefy.
Sure.
Definitely.
Which is perfect for Bill Hader.
No.
And then Kyle MacLachlan and Diane Lane.
Yeah.
Who like even rewatching it, I was just like, the parents.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that either.
Come on now.
Because why would you? Because they sound nothing.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I had no idea.
And Rashida Jones is in there somewhere as a small voice, so it's just like the whole cast of like The Office and Parks and Rec.
It is interesting. Yeah, it's like all the NBC comedies got together and inhabited this girl's brain.
Bing Bong. I have it right
Richard
here.
Kind.
Thank you.
Right.
Richard Kind is Bing Bong.
Yeah.
The Bing Bong character, when I first watched this, I wasn't sure that he was working for me.
I did not like Bing Bong.
Okay.
But that's partially because the idea of an imaginary friend creeps me out.
Wait, Michael, explain more about that, because you mentioned that earlier.
I don't know what else there is to explain about it.
Just the idea, so are you like haunted by the idea that like a child is like maybe hallucinating like a ghost being? Like wait, what's scary about it? Yeah.
Standing in the corner and Bing Bong.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know. Like I don't think it's even that rational, or that I've
thought
thought
more
about
like
it,
imagination play, like
that. Yeah. Like imagination, like I get, like, you know, and that the floor is lava, like 100%. Like I love that they do that. Like I'm on board with that. But to have like a persistent entity with a personality that you call upon multiple times to interact with and be your companion. I mean, for some reason that disturbs me.
How different is it than being a writer, though, and having these characters that you fully realize, imagine, come up with, that are then talking to you and through you, essentially, that are not you, but they are imaginary friends.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call them friends. I have no problem with other people having imaginary friends. It's just the idea of it. Well, I think that would disturb me.
Did you think?
Well, I think that I'm still trying to figure out the disturbing part. Is it because it's maybe supernatural in origin, or like what is scary about it to you?
I don't know. I think it's just something like unsettling. Like I feel like if I walked into a room and there was like a child like talking to a doll in a corner for like a long period of time, and like the doll seemed to have its own desires and will. I don't know. If
you
there's
clearly
something.
don't hang out with kids very much.
I think it's supernatural in origin for you.
Probably. Yeah. There's probably some deep-seated something in there.
I had an imaginary friend. His name was Dip. That's pretty much all I remember about him.
Wow. So you actually had an imaginary friend.
I didn't have a lot of real ones.
I just had a lot of Jurassic Park toys and Star Trek toys.
Right. Maybe that was like, as growing up essentially as an only child, I did have a ton of toys. So maybe it was my privilege to not.
Right.
Well, I'm sure that did you not name your toys and give them personalities and then like play imaginary games with them where there are like storylines and they're inhabiting their own world?
I think all my toys were from property. So it was like, you know, I would take Woody and he would go on a journey with Buzz, and I would reenact Toy Story and like create my own like stories sprawling out of Toy Story. But it was kind of always over the Ninja Turtles or
the expanded universe.
It's very normal to have imaginary friends.
Not saying it's bad.
That I agree
He's
with
just
you
terrified of it.
Clearly, I agree with you that the Bing Bong character is a little bit iffy for me in different moments. In some moments, I think the Bing Bong character is super important and really works. I think that in other ways, I wonder if that sort of moment for joy could have been illustrated a different way. Because the idea of the Bing Bong character is to get her to that place that we talked about, into that low point where she then has to sacrifice something. She has to realize that she's embracing sadness. But I wonder if there was another way to do it that didn't involve the Bing Bong character. Because at some moments, I'm like, he's just kind of being comic relief, or he's kind of being an emotional, I don't know, cheat code kind of like.
Yeah.
Because that moment when he does vanish and he willingly goes into the unconscious is so poignant for those of us that have forgotten things from our childhood that we are never going to remember. It almost is that Toy Story 3 thing where it's like, I'm sad about all the toys I ever gave up. You know, being able to create that sense of nostalgia and attachment that we used to have to inanimate objects or ideas, right? That's a critical part of childhood, is assigning emotionality to these things because they help us enact and understand the world. And so I think that in some ways it's sort of cheating to have a Bing Bong character, but at the same time it's beautiful and says something truthful about what it is to be a kid.
Well, yeah, and why not have a Bing Bong character?
Sure,
I did appreciate that literal visual representation of a piece of childhood being forgotten, and I think that's why that scene is
devastating.
That's the most cry prone moment for me.
Yeah,
because it's that feeling of like, oh wow, there are irretrievable things that are lost when you transition out of childhood into adulthood.
And I think like I wouldn't be surprised if the initial idea was to have a forgotten emotion be the character they found out in the wilderness. Like, you know, let's say excitement or something like that. Like something that like maybe...
I hope she can get excited again.
No, but that's my point, is that like we all have those moments where you go through years of your lives without maybe having experienced a certain emotion, but you can't kill off an emotion because then that suggests she'll never have that again.
Right.
So to replace that idea with an imaginary friend who doesn't mean you can't still be silly and still maybe remember Bing Bong once in a while, but to have that be the thing that you discarded once upon a time and you kind of have to get rid of in order to grow up, as much as it hurts. You know, I think like at least from a writing perspective, like that's why Bing Bong I think makes about as much sense as you could possibly think of.
No, and ultimately I'm not saying I would have done anything differently. I think the exact manifestation of that character is one that I find at times more resonant than others. So like, okay, he's cotton candy and he cries candy and he has a magical, you know, wagon. Okay, it's goofy in a way that sometimes I think steals some of the emotionality out from having, look, what if her imaginary friend, I don't know if I'm actually trying to pitch this, but what if her imaginary friend was more like a person, more like Riley? It would be even spookier and probably in a way that wouldn't be fun at all.
Probably the thing that Michael would be afraid of.
Right.
Well, because I think what you're saying is I think kind of true, which is Bing Bong is kind of the most on the nose, like almost stereotype version of like what was a little girl think is the most fun thing. It's like candy and dolphins and you know, it's like it's just the most obvious stuff.
Sure.
Which is kind of, but maybe that works because it's just you get it and it's easy and it's fun.
I remember visiting my friends and they had their daughter was probably 5 or 6 at the time, and we did end up watching Inside Out on that trip. But at one point, she got inside a box that she had decorated.
Of course.
And she said, "Push me," and I said, "Where to?" And she said, "Space, of course."
Yep.
You know,
you're Bing Bong.
Yeah, exactly. Like
you are Bing Bong.
I know. But I mean, but that is what your imagination is that you know. So Bing Bong is sort of like a great, even though it's goofy, it is sort of a great representation of like that child logic that doesn't need to make sense.
And I guess then it feels weird to us as not children anymore. Maybe
Speak
just
for
adds
yourself.
to that. But that we can have this reaction of like, Bing Bong iffy. Like I feel like that is a kind of an adult
response.
way to
How many
look at
kids
it.
are probably picking apart Bing Bong the way we are right now.
Sure.
But I feel like that Bing Bong moment, even though I don't, you know, the idea of an imaginary friend is creepy, I think it completely works for me.
Let it be known, Michael finds the idea of imaginary friends of children to be very disturbing.
Michael, I don't know if we would have been friends when we were kids.
Probably not.
No.
Wait, is this why you don't like E.T.?
This is why we
this ties in with E.T., doesn't it?
Oh,
I
maybe.
knew it.
Full circle.
Oh my God.
Because
solved
E.T.
it.
creeps me out.
I mean, but
He's
it is
basically an imaginary
he's an
friend.
imaginary friend, and it's basically
I
about the
don't-
love
ooh,
of a
I don't like
child
this.
for an imaginary friend. Or a lonely child and how our imaginations make us feel less lonely. And you don't like it. Michael's shaking his head.
Extremely uncomfortable right now. I do not like this revelation.
No.
But I think story-wise, I really appreciate, like when you're saying, Alex, that Pixar goes there. I feel like the Bing Bong moment is such a great moment for that. And I think it's another great example of a lesson to be taken from, that I take from it anyways, that a sacrifice has to be made for the protagonist to like grow. And I think that makes the growing so much more powerful. And I think Bing Bong is such an intense sacrifice because, like we said,
it's childhood.
It's childhood, right? Like, we're not going to lie. Like, as you grow up, you're going to forget things that were amazing and you'll never have them again. And that's just part of growing up. And so I love that they go there and make that joyous sacrifice so it all feels just that much more earned.
Right. And I think movies that really move me, we may have mentioned this before, but they're always bittersweet. If they're just very depressing and dour and like, life is hell, I kind of just detach and it's like, now I'm just watching this as a piece of art and I don't really care. But when they're bittersweet, when they, they show both the joy of life, literally, but also that, there's like real loss that comes along with that joy. That's when it hits me hard, because that's really, I think, the most honest representation of our life experience.
Well, to me, the scariest moment in this, or most upsetting moment in this, is where Riley is running away and the console starts to go dark.
Right. Yeah.
Like she's emotionally shutting down in a really upsetting way, where you're just like, you could feel all the sadness in the world, but that's so much better than being emotionally shut down.
Right.
And so it's what we were saying earlier about being open to all of those feelings, where the real moment where you start to feel the stakes. I mean, for me, when she starts to lose her islands of personality,
it's intense.
It's really intense.
It goes there. You change. You lose your interest that you had when you were
Friendship
younger.
Island falls into the Family Island. Falls into the abyss. It's so upsetting because it again is this sense of like loss of your own fully realized humanity or soul, I guess is a word I'm looking for. These things that make us who we are and all of the range of feelings that we have. Like feeling all of those things is so much better than feeling none of them. Right? And so when that moment is happening and the console is going dark, such a brilliant visual representation of what it is like to shut down emotionally, and close those doors and resolve to feel nothing. Just really, really good. But then the weight of it, we realize that's where all of this is leading. When you lose all of your islands of personality, all of your core memories, that these things that you use to define yourself, that you use to like access your own feelings, when you lose those, that's when you're really starting in danger of losing yourself. It's so intense.
Yeah.
But also in an interesting way, it allows for a new self to arise after it. So it's like there's a lot of loss, but then now we have the new complex emotions. You have kind of the new islands at the end.
Yeah.
So it's almost like this death was necessary. It's
and I feel like it's also though that like it doesn't fully reach that point, right? She doesn't ever fully shut down. And I like that as being part of the cautionary tale of like, if you don't let yourself feel these things that aren't happiness, like you could lose and I think that's probably how a lot of people in our society do deal with things.
They shut down.
They just shut down.
Yeah.
And they don't
look at social media, distract yourself all the time. Don't think about existential crises.
Yeah. So I think that it was also really brilliant that's kind of the stakes. It's not she's going to die or something. It's like something more worse almost is a loss of self.
Yeah, it reminds me when we were talking about Infinity War and Endgame, we were talking about stakes and how the stakes are the fate of the universe, and it's just like, and how somehow it's really hard to connect to that sometimes. Alex, you were saying that like, I don't care, I don't care. And you were saying that like a guy punching another guy is, has to have the emotionality underneath of it. And I think this is an amazing example of how the stakes can feel huge while being really, really specific, really focused to this character in this situation. It's good, small, but it's everything to Riley. It is Riley herself that's on the line here for Joy. And so that, yeah, very, very well communicated. And that's why that moment where she then has to be vulnerable to her parents, like has to come back and tell them how she's feeling. Is there anything harder to do?
Have you guys else like listened to like is it Brene Brown?
Yes, yeah.
Her whole thing. I heard her on a podcast recently, and she had
who's she?
She had some TED Talks and has a new Netflix special. It's all about like I think her special is called The Call to Courage. But she's very much all about researching vulnerability. Basically, that's like her like area of research, and how basically her discovery was that real courage equals being vulnerable. Like being courageous without vulnerability is not actually being courageous. You're just kind of doing a shortcut, safe thing. And how really so many conflicts in the workplace. She's a big consultant for corporations, and it's all about everybody's got their guard up, their armor up. Nobody wants to say how they're actually feeling. Nobody wants to actually communicate clearly what stories going on in their head about their coworkers or about what their fears and so many problems would be solved if people could just be vulnerable for that moment to clearly show what's going on inside of you, and then people understand you, and then the conflict can be solved.
Yeah.
But that vulnerability thing is so hard for us to do. We need to do it though if we want to get anywhere.
There's nothing harder than saying as truthfully as you can exactly how you feel. It's
terrifying.
Really,
yeah.
This had a weird thing jump to my head, which is the show Girls, which is very different from Inside Out.
Sure.
But one of the reasons I and a couple of people I know fell in love with Adam Driver's character on that show was that he would just make sounds related to whatever he was feeling. So she would say like, "Hey, do you mind if I spend the night?" He'd be like, "Sure," or whatever. But it was just such an interesting thing to watch because it's like, oh, here's someone. Almost like Ricky in American Beauty. Like here's someone who just has there is no facade. He just like says whatever's on his mind or just makes sounds about whatever.
Yeah.
But it was just sort of that feeling of watching a character who doesn't have those walls up. And it's just sort of they're there and they're honest. And it can be challenging, but also a relief to watch a character like that.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things that Brene Brown says too is that like just always being way too forthcoming about everything all the time is not like courageous vulnerability. Like oversharing all the time or just, always just blahing yourself at everybody is actually a weird defense mechanism in a way. It's like, I'm going to tell you all these deep things about myself right away, like, so I can know if I can trust you or not.
Right.
So it's like not saying that, like, don't
Sure.
vulnerability, like, in an intentional way to solve problems, not, always spilling your guts to everybody you meet.
Talking about like not being able to go back to your childhood and that kind of thing. I had a kind of a nice moment with this movie, which was when they get on the train of thought.
Oh yeah.
And it was, so just good. Sort of like, one of those like punny little things. It reminded me of this book I loved as a kid. Has anyone ever read The Phantom Tollbooth?
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
So I love that book as a kid, and it's all full of that kind of like, there's the spelling bee who's a bee who spells. Yeah. There's a watchdog who's part watch, part dog, and and the estranged kingdoms of Dictionopolis and Digitopolis, where words and numbers are, and I was like, I want to go read that book again. So
it's great.
Over the last week, I reread The Phantom Tollbooth,
Yay!
And it's still just so charming, and it just made it like really brought it back. And then I watched the movie, which I don't think I'd ever seen.
They made a movie?
Yeah, it's actually co-directed by Chuck Jones. So, and it has like voices of Mel Blanc and June Foray and like some of those greats. So it's beautiful in the sense that it looks like, Looney Tunes cartoons and that kind of thing. But it's kind of a goofy movie and not a great adaptation of the book, but it's not terrible. It has songs, which I don't know why it does. Anyway.
I love the jump to conclusions, where the conclusions is
Very
this
Office
island,
Space.
and like you have to like jump to conclusions.
Jump to conclusions, Matt.
Yeah.
I also just love that like the little kind of throwaway pun of like they mix up the facts and opinions and
Yeah.
the same.
Those get
and
mixed
it's
up all the time.
So
Right.
good.
Yeah.
Like these facts and opinions look pretty similar. Just throw them in the box.
I feel like that's one of those moments in the movie where I'm just like, this movie's winning. It's such a short moment, but it's so brilliant. Right. You just have so many of those.
I remember in the theater, the audience like erupting in laughter in that moment. And it's just like such a clear moment of like, okay, they have us. Like, you have the audience in that moment.
Totally.
And that's a joke like for adults.
Right.
Of course. Yeah. Well, one of my favorite moments is when they go through the abstract thought where it's like, we're abstracting. Here are the 4 levels. And the animation goes totally insane. And they just become like colors. And to get out of there, they have to just like fall on your face. And then they become lines. And they like, it's so good. It's
like an experimental short in the
It's
middle
almost like they could have
movie.
put that in the middle of any movie. But they're like, this seems like a good one for
Seriously.
it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, why don't we go around and talk about what lessons we're going to take away from.
Should we also talk about how we're really feeling today?
I mean, if you want.
Get real.
Who's driving?
Yeah, who's driving?
Who's driving today? That's the question.
But yeah, so lessons to take away from Inside Out. Brian, you want to start us off?
Alex pretty much touched on what my lesson I think is the strongest one that stuck with me, which is, as you talked about in your video, Michael, the process you have to get to come to sort of the obvious thing. You know, joy's foil being sadness seems like, in my mind, that would be what the point of the movie is. Let's make a movie about joy having to accept sadness, and that didn't even become what the movie was until 2 years or 3 years into the process or something. And I think it's Alex, as you also said, like not relying on that first idea you had. We find that a lot with our lessons from the screenplay videos too. Like the first idea that makes us think this is what we want to talk about. By the end, it's like that's not even really relevant anymore for the video that we're making. But yeah, so it's just that like sometimes it just takes a lot of work and a lot of back and forth and a lot of really like hammering your head an idea sometimes to come to the most obvious thing. I listened to a podcast with Marcus and Mafeely, who wrote Infinity War and Endgame, and they were saying some of those fan service moments, I am Iron Man or whatever, like it was almost the too obvious thing at the beginning, and then they spent several drafts coming up with different things, and by the end they're like, no, the obvious thing is the way to go. But it's stronger to come to that conclusion after throwing out all the other ideas than to just come to that conclusion from just saying, oh, that's the easy obvious thing to do, so let's just do that.
Wait, who's driving today, Brian?
Bing Bong.
Always.
Well done.
Nice.
Alex?
What I took from this movie that really stuck with me, watching it again especially, was just how you can do this deep metaphorical allegory type storytelling without it feeling too on the nose or too preachy or too just like, oh, it's like, hey, look, it's a movie about this. Like it is all those things. It is extremely on the nose in a lot of ways, but the story is just so compelling. The characters are so good. You're just along for the ride. You're along for the story. You're not like, I'm watching this movie because it's good for me and it's about really important themes that I should know more about. And it's a good lesson for myself as a writer because I often start with big ideas. It's like, I want to make a movie about this theme or this technology or this social thing happening right now. And it's just a good reminder of like, you can do that, but it only works if it's like Inside Out, where it's literally about that theme, but the story and the characters are just so compelling. Even if you didn't get any of that, that's what pulls you through the movie. So I think it's just a good example of very on the nose, very much about this kind of almost science, psychology, social stuff, but you don't need to, that's not what it's about. It's about the characters and it's about the journey, and it's just great storytelling.
Yeah.
Disgust is driving for you today, or
am I coming off as disgusted?
No.
I'm very even keeled right now, so I don't feel any particular driver at this moment. Yeah, they're all kind of balanced.
They're all just kicking back.
Yeah. Trisha,
the catharsis piece that we were talking about earlier, I feel like I get into my head a lot when I'm working on projects and I am trying to write something and I'm just trying to be smart, kind of what you were saying, Alex, where you're just like, I want to detach from what I'm writing and just like say something because I think I'm brilliant and whatever. And having to be vulnerable in the things that you write is terrifying. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and they said something like, how do you come across as really confident? And is that true? Like, do you really feel confident in your life? And I was like, Just in that, and I was like, yes, in the sense that I practice being confident. So it's not a veneer or like a false thing, but it's a lot of work. It's an interior work. And I think that as writers, we have a responsibility to do the interior work, whether that's in therapy or whether that's in our writing or both, or in our relationships, whatever it is, doing that work on ourselves so as to fully be ourselves in this world as vulnerably and bravely as we can day to day. Because that's truly all that we have to give to this world is ourselves. And that is what we are obligated to do if we are writers and filmmakers. And so it's terrifying, but I really respect that about this movie and Pete Docter. And it's a call, it's a challenge.
Yeah. Awesome. Who's driving?
Yeah, you can't get out of this.
I was about to like do it to myself, and I was like, maybe they won't remember. I don't know. It's probably sadness today, actually, to be truthful, but only because I'm kind of in pain and I have a scratch on my eyeball, which is totally insane. And the guys have been very patient with me, but I feel whiny and I feel mad, and maybe it's anger, sadness, somewhere in there. My memories are blue and red.
Maybe we'll put a picture of your eye in the show notes.
Oh, please don't. No.
What you're not hearing out there is we did put Trish in a different room so we didn't have to look at her.
It's horrifying.
It's more scarier than Bing Bong.
Nothing is scarier than Bing Bong. Yeah, I think my lesson is sort of what I've already talked about. The moment Bing Bong being left behind, creepy as he is, that I think that the level of sacrifice needed, I think, is something that it just really resonated with me. That like the stories I really love and am touched by are when people, like, if they mess up in like a big way and you feel it, and it's, you know, it's not kind of a fake death where the bad guys get away and it looks like, oh, maybe they're not going to catch them, but then they do. Like in this movie, you lose Bing Bong, you lose childhood. Like that's such a huge thing, and I think that, you know, there's a reason that's the scene that everyone remembers. And like you say, like Inside Out, and people like Bing Bong, right?
Exactly, they do. Yeah.
So I think just that's something I've taken away, is the importance of going there, making us care about something that the protagonist cares about, and then sacrificing it if that's the thing they need to complete their journey, I think is an important lesson.
Yeah. Intense, but yeah.
Yeah.
Who's driving? Anxiety?
Oh, is that an option?
Yeah, anxiety would be a good one. Yeah. I guess is that just fear?
I guess.
Yeah. Probably fear. I feel like, you know what? I feel like fear gets a bad rep. Fear keeps you safe. Like when she's running around and she's about to trip on the cord, fear is like, whoa. Let's navigate this properly, then continue on. I feel like fear is an important part of any personality.
Michael's head is just 5 slightly different versions of fear.
Perfect.
It's like, they're all the same, like body type.
It's fear, worry,
archetype.
Anxiety, apprehension, and doubt.
I love it.
Perfect.
Somewhere Joy is looking through the window.
All right, cool. Really quick, what have we been watching this week? Trisha.
So I recently saw a new movie that just came out like last month, and it's Mary Magdalene. It's starring Rooney Mara, Joaquin Phoenix, and Chiwetel Ejiofor, directed by Garth Davis. And it is a very ethereal, sort of Terrence Malick-y, thoughtful poem of a movie about Mary Magdalene, who is a character from the Bible that gets a bad rap because the church proper purposefully smeared her reputation for centuries. And so this is a much more humanizing look at her. Joaquin Phoenix plays Jesus, and Rooney Mara's performance is really lovely. Not a lot. It's not like an intense plot movie. If you like Terrence Malick movies and you have a tolerance for something that is, again, more like sort of lyrical exploration of an idea and a mood rather than a movie, you'll probably really like it, especially if you have any sort of interest in like the Bible or the history of Christianity and the religion. So it's, I don't know. I just really, really liked it. I loved how it was shot. And the text itself is not straight out of the Bible. The text is sort of interpretive in a way that I really like. So yeah, check it out.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
Alex.
So I just started watching Pen 15 on Hulu.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I love it so much.
Yeah.
I instantly fell in love, and I realized the creators, Maya Erskine and Anna Konkle, they were both born my birth year, 1987. So it's literally the year I was going to middle school is when it takes place. So it's all the same music, all the same everything, gel pens. And the brilliant part is, they're in their early 30s playing their 13-year-old selves. So they kind of have this perspective on it, and they're really smart about it, and they just capture it so amazingly. So I highly recommend Pen 15 on Hulu. So much fun. And if you're about our age, in your early 30s, it's I've never seen our middle school experience that literalized in a show.
I second the motion.
Yeah.
Check it out. Cool. Brian?
Well, Michael, there comes a time in every relationship where you have to admit certain things to someone.
No.
So it's time for me to tell you that until recently, I had never seen The West Wing.
Jacques Hughes.
I know.
That's not that bad.
It's the best show ever.
Yeah, it's bad if you know Michael.
Yeah.
Right, right.
I had seen every other Aaron Sorkin show, every episode of all three of his others.
Fascinating.
I know.
You watched Studio 60 before The West Wing.
I did, yeah.
Okay.
That's weirder.
Yeah.
You've seen
Well, I
every
think 'cause
other
it was
Aaron
on,
Sorkin show.
I wasn't watching stuff when The West Wing was
Right.
originally on. Whereas
Fair.
when Studio 60 came, it was, here's a new show I can watch, But I started taking the Aaron Sorkin masterclass online, and if you've seen the trailer for this thing, which you probably have if you ever turn on your computer,
Right.
You hear that he's also never seen anything from seasons 5, 6, or 7 of the show. So he and the team of writers, the sort of finale of the masterclass is that they break the teaser and first act of season 5, episode 1. So what sort of the Sorkin version would have been with these writers throwing out ideas.
It's almost kind of tragic.
Yeah. So I thought, okay, I watched the masterclass up until that point, and I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to go watch the first 4 seasons. So I watched the first 4 seasons of The West Wing, then watched Aaron Sorkin figure out what season 5, episode 1 would have been, and then went and watched season 5, episode 1. And now I'm slowly working my way through the rest of the show, which feels like a very different show, but not a bad show by any means.
Got to power through season 5.
Yeah,
Yeah.
By the last few seasons, I liked it again, but I remember season 5 felt pretty weird to me.
It's pretty dark.
It's also interesting that the directing style changes and just the quality of the show changes from a camera. So it's you're going from 4:3 into 16:9 over the course of the show, and you're going into shaky cam mode and stuff. So the show just feels like a different show because TV was evolving at that time too. So that makes it almost weird because you're it's the same characters in this almost different universe.
Right.
But anyway,
The director left at the same time. The director that started it.
Thomas Schlamme.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the West Wing is a good show, guys.
Which episode
Check
was
it
your
out.
favorite?
I mean, it's hard not to appreciate Two Cathedrals because of what it is. I can't think of any others off the top of my head just because I was sort of powering through it. So it's there were moments that were oh, there it is. I'm just waiting for Josh and Donna to get together, and that's all I care about at this point.
Well, well, I'm happy you name dropped Two Cathedrals. Obviously, that's all I was looking for.
Yeah, I knew it was.
Yeah. Michael.
All right, me. I finally finished The Office, so I can't talk about The Office
Thank
anymore.
goodness.
Haven't you used that 2 or 3 times in the show?
it's
as you're
too
I don't
watching?
think we've released the second time you mentioned it.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
There are some mystery podcasts out there. You may hear someday.
It's just me talking about The Office. So I finished that. So the next comedy I wanted to catch up on was Kimmy Schmidt. So I started the part 2 of the final season of Kimmy Schmidt, and it's okay. It basically makes me miss 30 Rock and how genius 30 Rock was and is.
Yes.
So maybe just go rewatch 30 Rock. That's my recommendation.
I will say, having, not to spoil anything, but having seen all of the end of Kimmy Schmidt,
Yeah.
yeah,
Some of it was great, but
yeah.
yeah.
It's a great show overall.
It seems to be really hard to end things. It's a recurring pattern of things,
I've
except for
noticed-
Endgame,
I've noticed,
apparently.
yeah.
Right. We are recording this on the about 4 hours before Game of Thrones season series
Before
finale
they
comes
come
up.
in and fix it all
Yeah,
and make it
somehow.
all worth it.
where we all go, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So all of you listeners in the future have already
It all made sense.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Screenplay. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us quite a bit. And tweet at us. Let us know what you like, what you don't like. Just want to say hi. Tweet us. My Twitter is at Michael Tucker LA.
I'm at Trisha Jean A. It's Trisha with a CIA.
At Brian Bittner.
At Alex_Calleros.
Awesome. And we will see you in the next episode.
Bye, everybody.
Bing bong, bing bong. No.